the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Bob Willard is a leading expert on quantifying and selling the business value of corporate sustainability strategies. He has given over 1,500 sustainability-related presentations to corporate, government, higher education, and NGO audiences. His 6 books, master slide decks, and dozen free open-source Excel tools and videos provide essential capacity-building resources for sustainability champions. He was inducted into the International Society of Sustainability Professionals Hall of Fame in 2011, received Clean 50 awards in 2015 and 2017, earned Best for World Overall awards for Certified B Corps in 2013, 2014, and 2017, and was the first company to reach the highest diamond tier of Canada's Net Zero Challenge in 2023. Now let's get into the episode with Bob. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Good to be back.
Well, thank you, Lysandra. Oh, we did it again, Jeff.
Well, today we're joined by our guest, Bob Willard, founder and chief sustainability champion at Sustainability Advantage. Welcome back, Bob.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, Bob, we realized it. Last time we spoke to you was 2021, and we thought it was like just last year. So time has gone very quickly, and the world that you have been living in and promoting, like us, trying to engage people, has changed in many ways. And so we're excited again to have you back, because I know you've been doing a lot of work in this what is deemed as, and we'll discuss, net zero procurement. But why I'm excited to have Bob here, not only because of his expertise and knowledge base, but we actually held a breakfast session with a group of industrial customers, from automotive to steel to construction material and chemical. And a majority of the participants were procurement people. And it was kind of a trial, because we didn't know what type of interest, but there was significant interest in the topic. And in fact, the rating from people that participated in that session gave it a really high. It was like a 4.5 out of 5. So I think our listeners are in for a treat. Listening to Bob and the work he's doing and how he's trying to make this happen in the sector. So Sandra, over to yourself.
Yeah, and Bob, we're really excited to have you back. You were actually our first guest ever on this podcast, and that first conversation was about organizational sustainability. So we're looking forward to this episode where we dive a bit deeper into that topic. To kick us off, what is net zero procurement?
Yeah, it's a great question. And also, why should we care about it as well, which I know we'll get into. But basically, it's trying to make sure that your suppliers are producing goods and services that are climate friendly, energy efficient, etc., and that you also encourage your suppliers to step up to what are called net zero targets. So there are targets that have been set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, to encourage companies to reduce their greenhouse gases down to 0 by 2050 and get halfway there by 2030. That's a very, very ambitious challenge. But unfortunately, unless we do that, things won't turn out very well. So we need to undertake engaging all companies, all organizations in reducing their greenhouse gases. So net zero procurement is intended to do that. It's giving credit to those who are producing climate-friendly products, as well as stepping up to reducing their own greenhouse gases by half by 2030, as well as all the way by 2050.
Thank you for that. I want to just give a bit of background, I suppose, for our listeners. Some of them will know this, but when we're talking about greenhouse gas reductions and things like that, we talk about scopes 1, 2, and 3. And I know that procurement impacts on scope 3, but could you explain to our listeners what scope 3 emissions are?
Sure, and it's probably going to be helpful to put it in the context of what the other 2 scopes are. So scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are coming from the operation of the organization or the company's own facilities. So if it's using natural gas, for example, to heat and cool their facility, that's creating emissions, greenhouse gases. So scope 1 are pretty straightforward. It's the operation of their own facilities, their own fleets, their own anything, and the greenhouse gases that are coming from that. Scope 2 is also pretty easy. It's that are coming from wherever they're getting their electricity from. So if they're getting their electricity from a coal-fired plant, they are accountable or mutually accountable for the emissions associated with the generation of the electricity that they're buying. In Ontario, we're very fortunate in that most of our energy is coming from either hydro or nuclear power. Some of it's starting to come from wind and solar, but most of it's coming from non-fossil fuel sources. There are a few natural gas plants, but the majority of our power is coming from relatively clean sources. But scope 2 are the emissions that are coming from wherever you're getting your electricity from. And then there's scope 3, and that's all the rest. Most of it's indirect. And scope 3 is a huge kludge of potential sources of electricity, of greenhouse gases rather, that you are indirectly accountable for. So if you are having your employees travel a lot, the greenhouse gases associated with their business travel are in scope 3. If your employees are driving to and from work, the emissions coming from their cars are in scope 3, and you are accountable for those. So employee commuting, employee business travel, transportation of your goods and services from you to wherever they're going, or from your suppliers to you, you're accountable for those as well. So a whole bunch of indirect things. In that mix is also an accountability for the carbon footprint, the embodied carbon in whatever it is that you're purchasing. If you are buying a computer, for example, it is holding you accountable for all of the greenhouse gases that were emitted in the production of that machine and the extraction of the raw materials to make the parts that went into that machine, etc. It's a huge kludge. And when you add up all of those different sources, the business travel, the computing, the commuting, the embodied carbon, transportation, all of those things, very often the greenhouse gases associated with scope 3, all of those things, and there are 15 categories of them, that add up to more than scope 1 and 2 combined. Very often they're somewhere between 50 and 90% of the emissions that a company is accountable for. And usually they are relatively clueless on those things. They're not paying much attention to them. So a company which is purchasing things is now mutually accountable for the emissions coming from its suppliers. And therefore, they want to deal with suppliers who are getting that stuff under control. And that's why net zero procurement is encouraging suppliers to disclose how they're doing on reducing their scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions.
Thank you. That almost puts it in a nutshell, doesn't it? Which is quite good. And hopefully everybody can understand it. Although you were saying there is interesting. There was a report recently that said that scope 3 emissions typically are 70% or more of an organisation's emissions. But what I found was also interesting is that 85% of people find that getting good data on those emissions to be a barrier to doing something about them.
Yeah, when you're trying to figure out what's happening in your supply chain, especially, that is really, really hard. Sometimes you have access to information about your immediate suppliers, your so-called tier 1 suppliers. Your suppliers that are delivering your goods and services directly to you. But you're also accountable for the emissions that are coming from deeper in their supply chain. So they're tier 2, they're tier 3, they're tier 4 suppliers. That is to say, they're suppliers, and your suppliers. And rightly or wrongly, companies are now being held accountable for trying to reduce all of those greenhouse gases and working with their suppliers to help them reduce them, which is a huge challenge because in many cases, companies don't even know who those tier 2 suppliers are, or tier 3 suppliers, or tier 4 suppliers. But there was a study done a few years ago by the company called Puma, the footwear, that 59% of their greenhouse gases and other environmental impacts were coming from their tier 4 suppliers, deep in their supply chain. So the people that raise the cattle from where they get their leather from, the people that raise cotton, the people that raise the rubber tree plants, all of those kinds of things. The access to that data is really, really challenging. Unfortunately, that's being used as an excuse for many companies not to pay attention to their other greenhouse gases, either scope 1, scope 2, or the other sources of scope 3 emissions. So yeah, it's hard, but we're getting better at it. And I think we still need to get on with the rest of net zero procurement while we figure out how to do that better.
Bob, I want to reinforce your comments on, or actually John's comments on getting access to data, because what you described for scope 3, there's some work to do, and there's quite a bit of work to do, and there's lots of opportunities. But I know as an organization that work with companies even on scope 1 and 2, they're even challenged, getting that information for scope 1 and 2. So John and I joke, if everyone got scope 1 and 2, we'd be able to get scope 3 really quite easy, or easier than what's being said. So this leads to the question that I have for you is, who is involved in implementing scope 3 reductions from your perspective?
Well, scope 3 are really being double counted. One company's scope 3 emissions are another company's scope 1 emissions. So if I was getting something from you, Dave, if I was buying something from you, and I was trying to be accountable for your emissions as a supplier, you are a scope 3 source to me. You're not involved in my HVAC system and so on. That's mine. That's my scope 1, scope 2. But your emissions are in my scope 3 arena. However, from your point of view, that's your scope 1 emissions. And I totally agree with you that suppliers need to be able to get their heads around what the greenhouse gases are that are being produced by their operation, either their buildings or the stationary equipment, or even their mobile fleet if they own it. So we've got a better chance of being able to do that. We're getting better on how to do those calculations and how to do some of the conversion factors that are required. But the need to do it is what has been missing. The demand to do it is what has been missing. And most companies have been sort of sitting on the sidelines waiting for government to fix climate change for them with all of these annual COP meetings that they have, conference at the parties meetings. And that's not working. Governments aren't able to fix it. And even the pledges that they make to reduce their greenhouse gases aren't being lived up to. And they can't be lived up to because they're pledging reductions of their countries' greenhouse gases. And those countries' greenhouse gases are coming from companies, in many cases, in those countries. So until we get the organizations themselves, the companies themselves, rolling up their sleeves and figuring this out, we're not going to be able to do what we need. So the reason that I am a big proponent of net zero procurement, especially from governments, is that it requires their suppliers to tell them to disclose what their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. So now you've got a big customer asking you, how's it going on your greenhouse gas reductions? And somehow, if a customer asks you, you're more inclined to do that than if a tree hugger asks you that question. I mean, customers are important stakeholders, and you need the revenue, you want the income. So it's coming from the big customers have enormous influence on the attention that organizations pay to their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's why I think if we can get, especially governments, but it could be anybody, starting to require their suppliers to disclose how it's going on this stuff, we could really start to pick up the pace of the greenhouse gas reductions.
So as a previous executive with IBM, you've dealt with lots of customers. When we're talking about who should be involved, from a company's perspective, what disciplines, like I know we're talking about procurement, but they tend to work for people in the company to get orders. Or who do you think should be involved in helping establish, defining, or capturing that? Is it just procurement people, or should there be other people involved in helping on the scope 3 from an organization standpoint?
So are you talking about on the customer side, David, or are you?
Yeah, on the customer, like for a customer to get that information, who do you think, or from your experience, can or should be involved in actually getting that scope 3 or making it happen? Is there any advice you have for people on that?
Yeah, well, if the customer is asking the question, usually the interface to the supplier is through the procurement department. And the procurement department would be then accountable for putting into the request for proposal, the RFP, a requirement or questions or specifications that asks about how it's going on your greenhouse gas emissions. So they're the ones that put it in. Usually the specifications that are in RFP are coming from the user department. So when I was selling computer systems for IBM and customers would send us an RFP, they would give us a whole lot of specifications about the attributes of that computer system that they were looking for. Those attributes didn't come from the procurement department, they came from the user department. The data processing department told the procurement department, these are the things we need, go get it. So the specifications are usually defined by the user department. However, the finance department has a lot of say over the decision to actually acquire these things. So finance and the user department have a lot of influence over what those specifications are. What we're suggesting is that it's in the interest of the finance department and the overall customer's organization to also be closer to the greenhouse gases that are coming from their supply chain, because they are going to be asked by other important people, bankers and investors and their own customers, whether they have got a handle on that. And it's becoming more and more evident that these are things that even if the user department doesn't think they're important, the company, especially in the person of the CFO or the CEO, may think it's important, and they want to make damn sure that every RFP requires suppliers to make these kinds of disclosures, regardless of what it is you're acquiring. The agent asking is the procurement department, but they're asking on behalf of others in the organization.
So what I'm gleaming is this has to be, it can't be siloed. It has to be integrated with the finance, the user, which could be the operational or the sales people, and procurement. And they have to work collectively to understand the ask and to make that happen.
Yes. And that's not necessarily a normal collaboration or a dynamic. So that's part of the challenge, is to get these different players, these different departments within an organization to collaborate on how they approach all of this and the questions that they ask and the weighting that they give to the answers when the disclosures are being made.
Thanks for that. If I can move us on to, you mentioned earlier about the categories within Scope 3. I think one of those categories is goods and services. So how critical is this and how useful is it to sort of focus on goods and services when you're looking at Scope 3?
It's really important. Goods and services make up the two first categories. As I said before, there are 15 categories. The first category is goods and services that you consume, like paper and ink and that kind of stuff. And then there are bigger things that are usually called assets that you're purchasing, and they're going to end up in your balance sheet. And you're responsible for the carbon footprint or the so-called embodied carbon associated with those products as well. It's the calculation of those things that's a struggle, and we're getting better at being able to figure all of that stuff out, and there are rules of thumb for how to do that, and there are organizations spending an incredible amount of time and money trying to come up with methodologies that are going to work. So for example, the federal government of Canada has something called a low carbon procurement project, and I'm an advisor on that, an external advisor. And the government of Canada is looking at the carbon footprint associated with three different kinds of things that they acquire. One of them is electric vehicles. They're going to acquire electric vehicles, but even though they're electric, they have a carbon footprint. So they want to be able to get the electric vehicles that have the lowest carbon footprint. Those vehicles could be cars, they could be vans, or they could be trucks. So it's three different kinds of electric vehicles, and they want to be able to figure out what the carbon footprint is of each of those. The second category is office furniture. It could be desks, could be chairs, could be shelving. So they need to be able to figure out the carbon footprint associated with a desk or a chair or a shelf. What's the math associated with that? What factors do you need? What data do you need? Then the third one is, this is kind of interesting. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out, but it's the carbon footprint associated with professional services. And professional services is code for consultants. So I don't think they're going to be looking at the embodied carbon in a consultant, but they're going to be looking at the amount of travel that is incurred, perhaps the amount of energy that's consumed by the use of electronic equipment in the execution of whatever contract they're doing. So how to figure all of that out appropriately is the third one. They've also, the federal government of Canada has spent an enormous amount of effort trying to figure out how to get the embodied carbon in cement reduced. So the term low carbon or no carbon cement is coming into vogue in infrastructure type projects, big construction projects. Now they're looking at low carbon or no carbon steel. How the heck are you going to produce steel with no carbon footprint? What does that mean? And how do you do that? And how do you give credit to the suppliers who are able to provide those kinds of structural components to big projects? And as you know, governments are really into infrastructure these days, bridges and buildings and all kinds of infrastructure. It's an enormous spend by them, and they're trying to make sure that they're taking advantage of the lowest carbon materials that are going into those structures, those projects. They're doing a lot of good research on it. So that's just a long way of saying that there's good work being done on it, but it's taking a long time to figure it all out. And we don't need to wait until we get all of those answers before we start implementing some of the other aspects of net zero procurement, because that's the product part. What I'm also interested in is the supplier part. Like, how's the supplier doing on reducing their scope 1 and 2 emissions? Well, we figure out the carbon footprint associated with the products they're producing. That's
Well, we're talking about scope 3, so it's so big. So, I think we've touched on some of these, but I wonder if you could sort of advise what you think are the challenges facing someone trying to address scope 3. But I'm going to, after you do that, I'm going to also ask you to layer in, okay, when they do it, what are the opportunities? When they do it, what are some of the benefits they're going to find by undertaking that? But let's start with, what are the challenges facing someone trying to address scope 3, if you can sort of summarize, because you have dealt with some of this already.
Yeah, I think you hit on it earlier, Dave. You talked about data and the availability of data. The challenge is getting the data to do the calculations. We know what the formulas are to be able to figure out the greenhouse gases associated with all of the 15 sources in scope 3. There's something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The GHG protocol has wonderful guidance on how to do all the calculations. The only challenge is you need to have data to be able to plug into the formula. And that's where the embodied carbon challenge is the highest. For the other ones, the other 13, it ain't that hard. We can figure it out. Like business travel, roughly how many flights are you taking? How far are they? What kind of planes are you flying? And that kind of stuff. We've got rules of thumb for being able to figure all of those things out, at least in estimating techniques, and driving and commuting and all that stuff. Once you decide you want to do it, it's pretty straightforward on how you do it. And then you refine your data as you get better and better information about all of that. So there are two things that you need. One is the data, and the second one is the desire. And the desire is the one that net zero procurement helps with, because if it's important to your customer to know that, it's important to you. And if the answers have a fair amount of weight or points in the bid associated with them, you're going to be significantly more inclined to provide that information, to provide those so-called disclosures. More and more important people are starting to ask these questions. We've talked a lot about customers and procurement. Investors are starting to ask these questions because they're really twitchy about whether or not the company that they're putting their money into is ready for climate change, and what are they doing to try to reduce their contribution to climate change and all that kind of stuff. So so-called impact investors are starting to ask more pointed questions about this stuff. And that comes back to the benefit to the company of getting their heads around all of this. They can very often save money once they start to realize the sources of these emissions, and they reduce the emissions they may also be reducing the expense associated with those emissions, whether it has to do with transportation or whether it has to do with embodied carbon in some of the products. So they may find that there are actual so-called eco-efficiencies associated with them reducing their greenhouse gases. Many companies are finding that solar and wind energy is significantly cheaper than fossil fuel energy as the price of wind and solar energy drops like a stone. It's dropped 60 to 90% in the last 10 years. And now it's actually price competitive. In fact, it's more attractive than fossil fuel in many jurisdictions. So this is not a penalty that it's not a sacrifice that we're asking companies to make. It's actually going in the right direction. And they are going to position themselves as companies that care about this and position themselves as the kind of supplier that more and more other companies want to deal with.
So glad you summarized the piece, because so often, we talk about the challenges and customers hang on to that and they hear how daunting it is, how expensive it is. But the last piece where you're saying, actually, when you actually undertake this, you're going to go, why didn't we do it before? Because it's just really good business. Not only can we increase our revenue by undertaking this, but we're actually cutting our costs. And I don't think that's properly understood in the marketplace. I think it's been positioned for whatever reason that this is a time waster and way too expensive to do. And I'm so glad you kind of conveyed that. No, this will make good business. Once you start capturing that information, that data, I think that will be critical.
Well, to end off this episode on net zero procurement, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think companies need to get it through their heads that this is not going to go away, that this is happening. It's not only the right thing to reduce your greenhouse gases and stop contributing to climate change, it's a business thing to do, because more and more organizations, whether they're customers or banks or investors, want to deal with other companies which are paying attention to this and consciously, intentionally reducing their greenhouse gases. So the first point is get used to it. This is not going to go away. The second thing is it ain't that hard. We know how to do this. We've got the formulas. A couple of areas in the scope 3 area are still challenging, but forget about those. Get on with the rest of them. And then the third thing is that they will be very pleasantly surprised about the extent to which their own employees get excited about this and help them do that, because employees care about climate change. They're worried about the future. And this is a great way to energize your workforce and send them signals that you are caring about the same things that they care about. And that's a very, very powerful component and byproduct of a lot of this attention on reducing greenhouse gases, especially earlier rather than later.
Thanks for that, Bob. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, listening to this, it suddenly dawned on me that an awful lot of people say we're having troubles doing things about scope 1 and 2 because it requires capital investment. Doing something about your scope 3 emissions, there is no capital required. It's something you can start doing today. And I think this is a message all of us working in this area have got to be getting over. Do something. There are things that you can do that are cost effective, make business sense, and make sense for sustainability. So why aren't we doing them? Just
building on that, John, I'm sorry to butt in it here, but there's a tool that I've got called a net zero assessment tool, which helps a company make that assessment on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And there's also something which is called a take action sheet. And that has about 3 dozen suggested ways to reduce your scope 1 emissions, your scope 2 emissions, and your scope 3 emissions. And it gives you an opportunity to show which of those are the most attractive financially as well as short term. So we know how to do this.
We do, don't we?
It ain't that hard.
I think again, coming back to what you said, I think you said an expression, and I think it's one we talked about silver buckshot a while back in one of our things. One of the things here is data and desire. And I love that as a couplet. And, if you've got one, you can probably get the other one. And if you've got both of them together, well, powerful.
Yeah, Senator, just for our listeners, I want people to know when Bob mentioned that he makes this available, that is free. to listeners. There's no charge for that. So that can't be an excuse for people. It's too costly. So I wanted to bring that up. Okay, my biggest takeaway. Wow, Scope 3 is huge. It's a really large part of carbon for clients. And so I didn't recognize that. I also hearing that this has to be integrated. Like procurement can play a big part, but this means there's going to have to be discussions and communications with operations, maybe the sales force, finance, and procurement in doing this. And by the way, from our experience, when they actually talk together, it's magic happens because they start communicating things that they didn't know that was going on, and then really good things happen in the company. So I think it's, as Bob said, it's doable. And John, that's a standout thing. This isn't capital costly to customers. So
No.
Really, there shouldn't be an excuse for them not to do it.
Well, thanks, Bob, Dave, and John, for your time. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.